The Great Locomotive Chase, the Civil War's most audacious train theft. In April 1862, a group of Union spies walked into Confederate territory disguised as civilians. No uniforms, no army behind them, no safe way out if they were caught. Their mission was simple: steal a Confederate locomotive, drive it north, destroy the railroad behind them, burn bridges, cut telegraph wires, and isolate one of the South's most important supply lines. For a few minutes, the plan worked. Then one man realized the train was gone, and what followed became one of the most unbelievable chases of the Civil War. This is the story of the Great Locomotive Chase, and this is Unresolved Files. By 1862, the Civil War had become a war of movement. Armies needed more than soldiers. They needed food, weapons, ammunition, reinforcements, and information. Railroads made all of that possible. A single rail line could move men and supplies faster than any wagon road. That made railroads one of the most valuable targets in the war. One of the most important railroad hubs in the South was Chattanooga, Tennessee. If Union forces could cut Chattanooga off, Confederate armies across the region would be weakened. But the railroad lines were deep inside Confederate territory. A normal attack would be dangerous, slow, and obvious. The Union needed something different. Not a battle, not a siege, a secret operation. Something small enough to slip through Confederate lines, and bold enough to damage the railroad before anyone understood what was happening. The man behind the plan was James J. Andrews. He was not a general. He was not leading an army. He was a civilian scout and spy working for the Union. Andrews believed a small group of men could do what a large force could not. They would move through Confederate territory in disguise, board a train like ordinary passengers, wait for the right moment, then steal the locomotive and drive it north toward Union lines. As they moved, they would tear up track, cut telegraph wires, and burn bridges. If the plan worked, Confederate communication would collapse behind them. Troops would be delayed, supplies would be blocked, and Chattanooga could become vulnerable. But if the plan failed, there would be no mercy. These men would not be captured in uniform. They would not be seen as ordinary soldiers. They would be behind enemy lines, pretending to be civilians. To the Confederates, that made them spies, and spies could be executed. Andrews needed volunteers willing to take that risk. Most came from Union regiments in Ohio. They were soldiers, but for this mission, they had to stop looking like soldiers. They changed into civilian clothing. They traveled in small groups. They created false stories. Some claimed they were heading south to join the Confederate Army. Others acted like ordinary travelers moving through the region. Every detail mattered. A wrong answer could expose the mission. A suspicious guard could end it before it began. A single telegraph message could put the entire South on alert. The men knew the danger, but they went anyway. Their target was a locomotive called the General. The General ran on the Western and Atlantic Railroad. Its route connected Atlanta and Chattanooga. That line was exactly what Andrews wanted to destroy. On April 12, 1862, the General stopped at a small Georgia station called Big Shanty. Today, that place is known as Kennesaw. At the time, Big Shanty seemed like the perfect location for a train theft. There was no telegraph office at the station. That mattered. If the train was stolen, Confederate authorities could not instantly send a warning from that spot. The passengers stepped off the train for breakfast. The crew moved away. The locomotive sat exposed. For Andrews and his men, this was the moment. They moved quickly. They uncoupled the passenger cars. They climbed aboard the General. And then they pulled away from the station. For a brief moment, the impossible had happened. Union raiders had stolen a Confederate train in broad daylight. The mission was alive. The locomotive was moving, and no one had stopped them. But someone noticed. His name was William Fuller. Fuller was the conductor of the General. When he saw his locomotive pulling away without him, he understood almost immediately that something was wrong. He did not freeze. He did not wait for soldiers. He did not wait for orders. He started running after the train, on foot. That is what makes this story so strange. One of the most famous pursuits of the Civil War began with a conductor sprinting down the tracks. Fuller ran for miles. He followed the stolen train as far as he could. Then he found a handcar. He used that to continue the chase. When the handcar could go no farther, he found another way forward. Then another, then another. Every time Andrews gained distance, Fuller found a way to continue. The raiders had expected confusion. They had expected delay. They had expected the missing telegraph office at Big Shanty to buy them time. They had not expected William Fuller, and they had not expected him to refuse to stop. As the general moved north, Andrews and his men tried to complete the sabotage plan. They cut telegraph wires, they attempted to damage track, they planned to burn railroad bridges behind them. If they could destroy the bridges, Fuller's pursuit would be slowed or stopped, and the Confederate railroad network would be badly disrupted. But almost immediately, the mission began running into problems. The weather had been wet, the bridges were harder to burn than expected, the railroad was busier than Andrews had hoped. Other trains were moving along the line. Southbound traffic forced delays. Andrews had to act like he belonged there. He had to explain why his train was moving north. He had to convince railroad workers that he had official business. He had to keep his men calm, and he had to do all of it while being hunted. Every stop cost time. Every delay gave Fuller a chance to close the distance. The mission was no longer moving like a clean military plan. It was becoming a desperate race. Behind them, Fuller's pursuit became more dangerous. He commandeered locomotives. Railroad workers joined the effort. Warnings began spreading from station to station. The stolen train was no longer a mystery. It was a known threat. Andrews and his men tried to slow the pursuit. They threw obstacles onto the track behind them. They cut more telegraph wires. They tried to damage the line. But Fuller kept coming. The chase moved through northern Georgia toward Tennessee, a stolen locomotive in front, a relentless pursuit behind, and the Confederate rail network waking up around them. The general needed wood, it needed water, it needed time, and time was the one thing Andrews no longer had. The plan depended on speed, but the raiders were being slowed by the very railroad they were trying to destroy. They could not simply race north without stopping. They had to manage the train. They had to watch the track. They had to avoid suspicion. They had to keep the locomotive running. And behind them, Fuller was turning the entire railroad into a weapon against them. At each stage, the pressure grew. The raiders knew that if Fuller caught them, there would be no easy explanation. They were not lost travelers. They were not ordinary passengers. They were men in disguise on a stolen Confederate train. And by now, everyone behind them knew it. Eventually, the mission reached its breaking point. The general was running low on fuel. The bridges had not been destroyed. The railroad had not been crippled. And the pursuit was still behind them. Andrews knew the operation had failed. There was no heroic final escape, no clean arrival behind Union lines, no successful destruction of the railroad. The train simply could not keep going. Near Ringgold, Georgia, Andrews ordered his men to abandon the general. The raiders scattered into the countryside. Each man hoped to escape on his own. But they were deep inside Confederate territory. The alarm had already spread, and the search was closing in. One by one, the raiders were captured. The Confederates did not see Andrews and his men as ordinary soldiers. They had crossed enemy lines in disguise. They had stolen a locomotive. They had attempted sabotage. To the Confederacy, they were spies. James Andrews was captured, tried, and executed. Several members of the mission were also executed. Others were imprisoned. Some later escaped. Some were eventually exchanged. The mission had failed. Chattanooga was not isolated. The railroad remained operational. The bridges were not destroyed, and the Confederate supply line survived. But the story did not disappear. Years later, several of the surviving raiders became among the first recipients of the Medal of Honor. The operation failed as a mission, but became legendary as an act of audacity. Because the Great Locomotive Chase was not just a train theft, it was a spy mission, a sabotage attempt, a pursuit, and a test of nerve. A handful of men walked into enemy territory, stole a locomotive in broad daylight, tried to tear apart a railroad from the inside, and triggered one of the strangest chases in American history. A chase that began on foot, continued by handcar, then by locomotive, and ended only when the stolen train ran out of options. The Great Locomotive Chase remains one of the Civil War's most daring operations, not because it succeeded, but because it almost did. If you had been one of Andrews' men, would you have boarded the general? Or would you have walked away before the train ever left Big Shanty? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy forgotten raids, impossible escapes, famous heists, and historical mysteries, subscribe to Unresolved Files. Until next time, stay curious.